This is a series that's based on the 10 Commandments. When you think about the 10 Commandments, I like to think of it like this. It's kind of like God's top 10 list. And we have a lot of top 10 lists in our culture. Do you ever watch SportsCenter? At the end of every SportsCenter, what do they have? The top 10 plays of the day. You know, if the FBI has the top 10 most wanted individuals. If you turn on Netflix, it's got the top 10 shows that they encourage you to watch. It's always about the top 10. In fact, I even found a top 10 list of student athletes at Carolina that have graduated. There's only 3 on the list right now, but I think they're moving in the right direction, right? But there are a lot of top 10 lists out there. I want you to know that God came up with the original top 10 list. It's known as the 10 Commandments. And so that's the series that we're going to be in. And I'm actually excited about this series based on a survey that I read recently. I think we really need this study. For example, of Americans who were surveyed about the 10 Commandments, less than 45% could recall the commandment, honor the father and mother. Well, that may explain why we have some of the issues that we have in our culture, right? 43% of Americans surveyed knew that Bobby and Peter were 2 of the brothers in the Brady Bunch, but they did not know that remember the Sabbath was actually a commandment. In fact, according to a Gallup poll recently, only 47 of adults in America could list 5 out of the 10 commandments. I almost gave everybody a piece of paper today and gave you a test. Aren't you glad I didn't do that? See, that's my old school teacher coming out. And I was going to have you list. It would have been interesting because I would have collected them. It would have been interesting what many of us think are maybe 10 commandments, right? But only 47% knew 5 out of the 10 commandments. So I think it is a timely study. And there's a couple of things I'm excited about as we get into this study, because I'm excited because the 10 commandments, as you're going to see, can actually help us live the life that Jesus has called us to live. And I say that because there's an interesting familiar story in Mark chapter 12 in the Gospels. And you remember when Jesus was on the earth, the Pharisees were constantly trying to put him into a situation he couldn't get out of, or maybe ask him a question that he couldn't come up with the answer. Like, do you give tribute to Caesar, to God? How do you handle these situations? So in Mark chapter 12, the religious leaders, they came up to Jesus one day and they dropped this bomb on him. They said, hey, Jesus, could you sum up the Old Testament? Now, let me just ask you, what if you drove home today, you got out of your car, you saw your neighbor walking across the lawn, say, hey, I know you go to church. Could you do me a favor? Could you sum up the Old Testament? How would you handle that, right? And nobody wants to get in that situation, but Jesus said, yeah, I can handle it, no problem whatsoever. And this is what he said, Mark chapter 12, verse 30. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And what you're going to see over the next few weeks, that actually covers the first 4 commandments. And then he says this, Mark chapter 12, verse 31, the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's covered in commandments 5 through 10. So basically he says this, love God, love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. That's what we're going to learn in this series. How do we love God? How do we love our neighbor? But this is what's interesting. We're going to learn that how we love God will determine how we love our neighbor. And we're also going to learn even today that how we love our neighbor is going to impact how we're able to love God. I'm actually working on a mission statement for Be Renewed Church. Every church should have a mission statement, and this is the one I'm working on, especially as I was working on this message. Love Jesus relentlessly, love people. I hate to say it, but unconditionally. And it gets me a little teary when I say that, because you know what I've learned? It's not easy for us to love people unconditionally. It's easy to say, love people unconditionally. Do you know when it's hard to love people unconditionally? It's when maybe something they're involved in or doing impacts us personally. It's one thing to, remember the old saying, love the sinner and hate the sin? It's not easy to do both. So what is the group of people, what if we were involved in absolutely loving Jesus relentlessly and loving people unconditionally, regardless of the baggage that they brought into this place? We're like, we don't really care. We're here to love you unconditionally. And that's what we're going to learn in this series. How do we love God and love our neighbor? By the way, the 10 Commandments appear in the Bible 3 different times. They're listed for us once in the book of Exodus. They're listed for us twice in the book of Deuteronomy. I'm going to show you the list in Exodus chapter 20 in just a second. But before I do that, let me show you an interesting verse in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28. Moses was there with the Lord 40 days. This is up on Mount Sinai, and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets the word of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So I wanted you to understand the 10 Commandments isn't just something that publishers of the Bible or theologians came up. God named them the 10 Commandments. Now, I'll just tell you, I have preached on, this is my 44th year of being a pastor. I have preached series on the 10 Commandments at least 5 or 6 times, but this is what I want you to understand. When God gave us the 10 Commandments, I don't think that his number one priority was just to give us a list of 10 rules that we're supposed to follow. I don't think it was just to give us a whole lot of do's and don'ts that we were supposed to obey. I think God was giving us 10 principles for living, and you're going to see in this series, these 10 principles can enhance our relationship with God, but they also can enhance our relationship with one another. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. The 10 Commandments are commandments, and we're supposed to obey the 10 Commandments. But I believe that if we can just get past the rules, and if we can begin to see the principle behind these commandments can actually change and alter and repair our relationship. In fact, as we're going to see in this series, the 10 Commandments is all about relationships, and that shouldn't surprise us because God is a God of relationship, and you can see this principle all the way through the Bible. I mean, think about this. When God created Adam and Eve, they didn't have to do anything to be in a relationship with him. He created them in relationship for relationship. They didn't have to repent. They didn't have to pray the sinner's prayer. They didn't have to go down the Roman road. They didn't have to go to the front of the church somewhere and say, I want to be a Christian. They were created in relationship for relationship. In fact, one of the interesting verses in Genesis chapter 1 is in verse 28. Right after God created Adam and Eve, you know what it says? And he blessed them. The very next, he blessed them. Let me ask you a question. What had they done to deserve being blessed? Absolutely nothing. They've just been created, right? But God created them in relationship, for relationship with him, and he blessed them. God redeemed, as you're going to see in this series, he redeemed the children of Israel for relationship. In fact, right before God gave the 10 Commandments, he reminded the children of Israel, this is all about relationship. I'm redeeming you so we can have a relationship. Let me show it to you. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then he gives the very first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. So think about this. Before God even gives them the 10 Commandments, he reminds them, I brought you back. I purchased you back. I redeemed you out of bondage. I redeemed you out of slavery so that we could have a relationship. Now, I want you to understand, that is the exact same thing that he did for you and me. He redeemed us out of our bondage, out of our slavery to sin so that we could be in a relationship. Let me show you how Paul put it in Romans chapter 6, verse 6. For we know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. So this verse, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 6, we were slaves. Every one of us were slaves. We were slaves to sin, but God redeemed us out of slavery and out of bondage to sin. And so what I'm telling you this, I don't want you to see the 10 Commandments just as a list of rules. I want you to begin to see the 10 Commandments as principles that can remind us every day that God redeemed us so that he could be in a relationship with us. Now, all of the 10 Commandments, the first time they appear, Exodus chapter 20, they're listed for us in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. But I want to show you what happened immediately after God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on the top of Mount Sinai. Let me show it to you. Exodus chapter 20, verse 18. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us or we will die. That's an interesting concept. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test. The Hebrew word is purify. He's come to test you, to purify you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. In other words, this is what Moses says to the people. God is giving you some principles to help free you from bondage, but not only to help free you from bondage, he's given you some principles to help you stay out of bondage. But I want you to notice their response in Exodus chapter 20, verse 21. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. So what's happening in this scene? Well, Moses has determined that he wants to have a deeper relationship with God. The people have determined we want to have a deeper relationship with God. But this is what's interesting. The people wanted to have a deeper relationship with God, but through Moses. In other words, their attitude was this. Hey, listen, Moses, you go meet with God, and then you come back and you tell us what he says. And I read that and I thought, whoa, wait a second. Doesn't that sound like most Christians and most churches today? Hey, Mike, you go up on the mountain, you meet with God during the week, you hear what he has to say, and then you come back and we'll show up on Sunday and you can tell us what he said. After all, that's why we pay you. Go do your job, right? Tell us what he said. Well, but did you notice why they didn't want to meet with God? Exodus 20, verse 19. Do not have God speak to us or we will die. Now that sounds like a bad thing, but that's actually not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, because remember what Paul referred to in Romans chapter 6, verse 6, he referred to the old self. What's the old self? Sometimes it's referred to, especially in the book of Galatians, as our flesh, okay? You have an old self. And the longer you lived in the old self, as a part of the old self, the harder of it is going to be later on in life for Satan to let go of those old habits that you had before you became a Christian. So if you were like me and you accepted Christ when you were 5, you probably didn't have too many alcohol problems or drug problems and things like that as a 5-year-old, right? But you know what? Say you came to Christ when you were 30, 35, or 40. That's a lot of years of your life where the old self, the flesh, ruled. And now the Holy Spirit is taking up residence in your life. And Paul says in Galatians chapter 5, there's this war that begins to take place. And so the people are saying, listen, we don't want to be in the presence of God or we will die. Because here's the thing, the old self, which is really our will, what we want for our life, our ambition, what we want for our life, our desire, understand, the old self always dies in the presence of God. And as Christians, that's what we want to happen. We want the old self to die. In fact, that's one of the great things about being in the presence of God. Because, see, it's not until the old self actually dies that Jesus literally can begin to live and to reign through us. And that means that the more time we spend with God, the more time, the more we can actually put to death the old self, and we can begin to experience the new life that Jesus has to offer. Let me just show you a verse that goes right along with this thought. Psalm 103, verse 7. Maybe you've never noticed it before. He, that would be God, made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel. Let me read that again. He made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel. Let me say it this way. The people of Israel, they knew what God did. They knew that God brought the plagues down on Pharaoh so that they could be freed. They knew that God parted the Red Sea. They had seen it. They knew that God could bring water out of a rock. They had witnessed it. They knew that God brought down manna from heaven. They had seen his ways. But understand this, they saw what God did, but Moses knew why God did it. In other words, Moses understood the ways of God. He didn't just see the acts of God. And I don't know about you. I don't want to be someone who can just talk about what God has done. I want to be someone who can know his ways. Well, let me just say it another way. I don't want to have a relationship with God based on thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. How many of you grew up Catholic? That's what your relationship was right? How many of you grew like me Baptist? You're still in recovery. Okay, see, but isn't that what your life was all about? Thou shalt not, thou shalt not. I don't want a life like that. I want to have a relationship with God that's based on principles that allow me to go deeper with God and get to know him better. So it's all about relationship. So we're going to see a relationship principle behind each one of these commandments. And the relationship principle behind the first commandment is the principle of priority. Let me show you the first commandment again. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, let me just tell you, this group is not like any other group. So when most Christians hear that, you shall have no other gods before me, this is what you think, because you're kind of looking for a loophole. You're thinking, well, you know what, when it says you shall have no other gods before me, sounds to me like maybe it's okay to have other gods. It's okay to have money as a god. It's okay to have my career as a god. It's okay to have my kids as a god. Maybe it's a hobby that I have. It's okay for it to be a god as long as it's not first in line. It can be a god, but it can't be the first god. Now, I want you to understand, if you're looking for a loophole, that's not what this is saying. Think about it. This word before, we have a little grammar lesson here, and I can see your eyes glaze over the minute I say that, okay? This word before, it can either be a conjunction or it can be a preposition. What's the difference? Okay, Don't let your eyes roll back. Stick with me for a second. What's the difference between a conjunction and a preposition? Well, a conjunction joins two thoughts. For example, I tried to hit the nail, but I hit my thumb instead. It joins two thoughts. A preposition clarifies a thought. I tried to hit the nail on, that would be the preposition, on the head. So understand what we're seeing in the commandment, thou shalt have no other God before me. This isn't a conjunction. In other words, it's not joining two thoughts together. It's a preposition. It's clarifying the first thought. And if you remember your grammar lessons, you know that a prepositional phrase is not the main part of the sentence. In fact, you can take the prepositional phrase out of the sentence and the sentence doesn't lose its meaning. For example, I tried to hit the nail. That's the main thought. I tried to hit the nail. On the head, it's just a clarifying thought. So here's the statement. You shall have no other gods, period. That's what the commandment is. You shall have no other gods, period. And then God clarifies it before me. Now, why did God have to clarify it? Well, think about the situation here. These are people, the Hebrew people, who have been enslaved and in bondage for 430 years in Egypt. Egypt had more gods than any other culture or society that has ever existed. They were polytheistic. Poly means many, theist means God. They had a lot of gods. In fact, they had 24 major gods. I have a slide of the different names of the 24 major gods of the Egyptians. Two of my favorite is Nut and Conclusion. Okay, I think those are just great names for God. They had 24 major gods. Now think about this. They had 2,000 lesser gods. We might call them minor league gods. They never quite made it to the majors, okay? So 24 major gods, 2,000 lesser gods. So there's a lot of gods. This is what God is saying to the people. You shall have no other God, period. Now this is what's interesting. This Hebrew word translated before, it literally is in the Old Testament thousands of times. It's only translated before a few times. One of the other translations is besides. So think of it that way. You shall have no other God besides me. Another way it's translated, this very same Hebrew word is other. You shall have no God other than me. In fact, let me show you an example of this word, Isaiah 45, verse 5. I am the Lord and there is no other. Okay, that word other, it is the exact same Hebrew word that is translated before in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. So basically what he is saying is, there is no other Lord. There is no God beside me, behind me, in front of me, above me, below me. There is no other God. Are you following me? Are you sticking with me? Okay. So God is giving us a principle based on this first commandment, and it's a principle that can enhance our relationship with him. So what is it? He's saying this, I have to be first. I have to be first in your life. I have to be top priority or this relationship isn't going to work. But I also want you to know that this principle of priority works in our human relationships as well. And I'm going to give you an example. I started pastoring when I was 24 years old. I had been a PE major. I was teaching science and coaching football at a high school in Long Beach, started visiting a church. They asked me if I would teach their high school Sunday school class. I did. They hired me to be the youth pastor. I walked away from teaching. I became the youth pastor. About 9 months later, the senior pastor had to retire for health reasons. So they said, would you become our senior pastor or fill in for a while? I filled in for a while. The church was growing. They said, you just become our pastor. So for about 2 years, I was actually the senior teaching pastor and the youth minister for Sunday school. That was an interesting dynamic to pull that off every Sunday morning. But I had never even been to seminary. So when I became a pastor at about the age of 25, I went to seminary. So I'm going to seminary and getting trained in seminary at the same time I'm pastoring a church. But there, I was in a ministerium, and it was a cool ministerium. If you've ever heard of Chuck Swindoll was in the ministerium with me. What a phenomenal man he is. Another was Dr. George Peak, who had one of the few mega churches I ever knew of in those days, and it was in Long Beach, California. And for some reason, he saw something in me. And he had lunch with me one day, and he says, I want to meet with you every week. Every Friday, let's get together, come to my office, and I just want to pour into you. I don't know why he did it. He was much older than me. I know he didn't have time for me, but he did. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in his office one week, and I was kind of venting because I've got young boys. I'm trying to pastor a church. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm in seminary full time. All of these things are going on, and I just felt overwhelmed. And so I was telling him about that, and so he slid a piece of paper across his desk. I was sitting on the other side of the desk. He gave me a pen, and he said, Mike, write down your priorities. Well, I got this because I grew up in a Baptist church. And if you grew up in a Baptist church, you know that the key to joy is what? Jesus, others, yourself, right? That's how you find joy in life. You put Jesus first, others above yourself, and then yourself. So I wrote J-O-Y, Jesus, others, yourself. He looked at it, wadded it up, threw it in the trash can, gave me another piece of paper. He said, try again. All right, okay, I'm a little confused now. I know Jesus has got to be first, so I put Jesus down. But I thought, it just doesn't seem right saying that I'm more important than others. But I put down Jesus, yourself, and others. Of course, I'm thinking, this can't be right because it doesn't even make a real word. You know, it's Giro, right? That doesn't make a word, right? So I put down Jesus, yourself, and others. And I slid it across to him. And he looked at it and wadded up and threw it in the wastebasket. He gave me another piece of paper. He said, I want you to try one more time. And he said, I'll give you a hint. He said, the first one is others. So I sat back and I began to argue with him. Now here is a 65-year-old doctor of one of the largest churches I had ever seen. But I'm a 25-year-old first-year seminary student. I know everything. So I'm literally arguing with this man about he can't be right. He says, I'm telling you, the first one is others. And this is what he said to me, and it changed my life. He said, Mike, when you put others first, you're putting God first. In fact, he said, if you can't serve others, you can't serve God. Now think about that. If you're married, you know what I'm saying? If you can't serve your spouse, you can't serve God. If I can't serve Shannon, I can't serve God. How about this? If I can't serve you, I can't serve God. I don't know if you guys were here last week for Easter, but the first service, I was kind of out of sorts. In fact, somebody came up to me and said, you have a migraine today? You didn't seem to be yourself. And I'll tell you why. Easter's always stressful. I woke up Easter morning, I felt like totally under attack and oppression. I just felt like, ugh. In fact, when Shannon got up, the first thing I said, we just need to pray. We just need to pray. I'd gotten a message that was not a very kind message. I don't know why somebody felt they needed to give it to me on Easter. And then that just my mind was in a bad place. And then you come in here, and I'm telling you, coming into Ray's on a Sunday morning to get ready for church is like coming into the den of iniquity. It's like what Jesus walked in when he had to run the temple people out, you know? I mean, there's broccoli all over the floor. We find blood every once in a while. So we're coming in, and we're trying to get set up for Easter, and, you know, we're trying to do all these different things, and we're just trying to get it all together. And then about 10 minutes before the first session, a need came across my attention. Somebody said, can I meet with you? And I just remember saying, you know what, I got to speak in 10 minutes. I just can't do it right now. I can do it afterwards, but I just can't do it right now. That bothered me so much, my entire message. Because I had been studying this message, getting ready for this week. And I thought, Mike, you're going to get up on Easter and talk about the great, amazing opportunity we have to be redeemed because of what Jesus has done for us. And you don't have time for somebody who really needs you. This principle I have never, ever, ever, ever forgotten. If you can't serve others, you can't serve God. Now, I want you to understand, that is the principle of priority behind the first commandment. And when you understand this principle, it will change your relationship with God, and it will begin to change your relationship with people. In other words, what takes priority in our lives indicates whether or not God has priority in our lives. That's how you have to think about it. In fact, this principle runs all the way through the Bible. Think about this. When the Jews were first going into the Promised Land, do you remember what was the very first city they came up against that they had to defeat? It was Jericho. And God gave some very, very interesting instructions to them before they went in. He said, after you defeat the city, get all the gold and all the silver and bring it into the house of God. Now, this is what's interesting. The Israelites took down a lot of cities in the Promised Land, in the land of Canaan. This is the only city where God gave the instructions, get all the gold, get all the silver, and bring it into the house of God. Why did God say it? Why was it so specific to Jericho? It's because Jericho was the first city. It's this principle of priority. Later on, God said this, He's the firstborn of all your flocks and herds belongs to me. Why did he say that? It's the principle of priority. He didn't say, hey, when your sheep has a bunch of new lambs, let the sheep have all the lambs, pick the run of the litter, and give it back to me. No. He says, when your sheep has lambs, would you give me the first one? It reminds me of an old joke about a farmer. Came running into his kitchen. His wife was in the kitchen. He's just jumping down. He's elated. He's laughing. And she said, what is wrong with you? He says, I just went out to the barn and Bessie had twin calves. He says, God's so good to me, I'm going to give one of them back to God. Woo! And they're dancing around the kitchen. God's so good. God's so faithful. The next morning he came down. His head was down. He was all dejected. She said, honey, what's wrong? He said, God's calf died. Isn't that the way we do it? Isn't that somebody just came in this morning, Tim, I'm going to tell you, and showed me 2 lottery tickets. He said, I bought 2 lottery tickets. He said, I bought one for me and one for my friend. And he has some numbers circled. He said, that's the winning one. He said, guess which one is my friend's? Okay, don't we treat God that way? Is it, when, for example, let's use our finances. Let's say that we put God first. We're going to give $25 a month, $100 a month. Whatever it is, God, I'm committed. I'm going to stick with it this time. And then you have a flat tire or a bill comes. What is the first thing that gets cut? God. He doesn't really need it anyway, right? He's not really that big of a priority. See, we don't sit down and say, you know what, I got to figure out do we eat out less? Do we travel less? Do we do less with the kids? Maybe they're spending too much money going to all their activities. No, God is the first thing to get cut. See, we don't understand this principle of priority. God said later on, when you harvest, give the first fruits to me. In other words, don't pay all your bills first and then see if you have something left over. Give me the first fruits. In fact, this is the reason that God accepted Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain's offering. By the way, let me just tell you something interesting about this story. The story of Cain and Abel took place 2,500 years before the 10 Commandments. In fact, it took place 2,500 years before God ever even brought up the topic of giving the tithe. And so a lot of people question, why did God accept Abel's offering but reject Cain's? God hadn't even established this tithing thing. Well, the answer is in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits. It doesn't say the first fruits. He brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel brought an offering, fat portions from some of his, there's the key word, the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. I want you to understand this principle of priority. It runs all the way through the Bible. God basically says this: life only works the way it's supposed to work when you put me first in every area of your life. Let me say that again. Life only works the way it's supposed to work when you put me first in every area of your life. And then Jesus comes along in the New Testament, and he reiterates the same thing. Matthew 6, verse 31. He says, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And look at what it says. All these things will be given to you as well. Understand, in your relationship with God, God knows that you need to make plans for retirement. God knows that you're probably going to have some kids that you have to send to college. You have rent, you have mortgage, you have insurance, you have responsibility. He is aware of the culture that we live in. But Jesus says this. He says, you put God first, and all of these other things that he's very well aware of, if you will put me first, all of those things are going to fall into place. There's a really cool story in 1 Kings chapter 17. There's a famine in the land, and it was announced by Elijah. He went to King Ahab of Israel, and he said, just so you know, you better prepare. There's going to be a famine. It's going to last for 7 years. Well, of course, Ahab wasn't that happy with Elijah. And so God said, we better get you out of town. And so he tells Elijah to go and to hang out by the brook Kerith. And he hangs there, and it says that God fed him by ravens in the morning and by ravens in the evening. I mean, every morning a raven showed up with an Egg McMuffin. How cool is that? A Jersey Mike sub that night, cool water to drink right out of the brook. But after a while, one morning, Elijah woke up and the brook had dried up. And God said, it's okay, we're done here. Pack up your stuff, you're heading to Zarephath. I want you to go to 123 Elm Street, and there's a widow there, and that widow, she is going to take care of you. So sure enough, he heads down to Zarephath, he goes to 123 Elm Street, he knocks on the door, the widow comes to the door, he says, it's been a long journey, could I have a glass of water? And she says, yes, you may have a glass of water. And then he says, I'm really, really hungry. Do you have some bread that I could eat? But I want you to see her response. 1 Kings 17, verse 12. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. This is one of the saddest, most pathetic scenes in all the Bible. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel said, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away and she did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but there's actually a couple of things going on in this story. On one hand, God sends Elijah to the widow's house so that the widow can take care of Elijah. But on the other hand, God sent Elijah to the widow's house so that he could provide for the widow also. I mean, think about this. He shows up. She's got one meal. That's it. She's going to die. She's going to die. And so God says through Elijah, you put me first. You put me first and watch what happens. When I was at Hope, there was a single mom who wanted to talk to me one Sunday morning after. She's like, I got 3 kids, and I really want to trust God. I want to trust him in the area of my finances. And what do I do? And I said, well, just got to start giving something. Pick something. Pick something that's going to cost you something. Pick something that's going to stretch you and challenge you. But pick an amount, any amount. God's more interested in the heart than the amount. And just decide you're going to give it regardless. That was it. Didn't see her for a few months. A few months later, she caught me out in the atrium afterwards. She said, I got to tell you the most amazing story. She said, I started doing it. And there were a couple of months that, man, it got pretty gnarly. I didn't even know if I was going to be able to feed the kids and make the rent, but I did it. I didn't cut God out. I did it. And she said, I got to tell you a funny story. She said, I got a promotion at work. And with the promotion came a raise increase. But she said, this was what's interesting. After everything went through HR, they called me back in and said, we noticed for the last 3 years you were in the other job, you were really underpaid. So we're cutting you a check to make up for the money that we underpaid you for the past 3 years. And then she said, 3 weeks later, they called me and said, you're doing such a good job. They gave me another raise. Isn't that an amazing story? I'm telling you, when this single mom obeyed the first commandment, when she practiced the principle of priority, my point is God blessed her in ways she couldn't make up. She never saw it coming. And I'm telling you, in the same way, when we obey the first commandment, we live out the principle of priority, we have a front row seat as God just shows up and he does his thing. And I tell you, when God does that, oh man, it takes our relationship with God to a whole new level. It just blows our mind. This is what Jesus said. He said, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time together this morning. And man, I don't want to blow anybody away or freak anybody out, but Father, you're moving. In just a few months, you've done what you've done here. Father, I think right now the average church in America is 65 people. 90% of churches never make it to 200. In fact, 90% of churches that start never even exist after 3 years. But obviously you're doing something here, and it's with a little bit of fear that maybe we think about moving forward because it's comfortable here and it's secure here. So, Father, one of the things that challenge us is that there are people that are lost, and we have the answer to life beyond the grave, but we also have the answer to life now, and we need to be a part of bringing your kingdom to this earth in those areas. So I pray you'll stretch us, you'll grow our faith, and Father, I know from experience, we will look back on these days and we'll say, do you remember when? And there will be a track record, just like the Israelites used to build little monuments of stone so they could go point to them and say, let me tell you what God did there. And they would tell their kids and grandkids, let me tell you what God did right there. And we will see your faithfulness along the way. So we're excited to see where you're taking us. And Father, it may not be much bigger than this, and that's fine too. but we just want to be obedient. And we just want to go to bed at night saying that we're in sync with you. And we're going to give you the credit and the glory right now for what you're going to do. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.